Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicholas Tamoncho, Head of Architecture here at MIT. I extend my thanks and welcome to you all for joining us here tonight for the launch of Thresholds 49 Supply, part of our department's Spring 2021 online public program. Given that MIT still exists in the world in a physical place, which we are returning to ever more carefully day by day, I want to begin, as is now our practice, by saying that MIT acknowledges Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which MIT stands is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. These words are important, but the risk is, of course, that they remain words. The best possibility we can hope for, instead, is that they shape our reality. To those of you joining this program as part of our open house today, I'm happy to welcome you to a very MIT event, the annual launch of our student-edited journal, Thresholds, distributed by the MIT Press and advised by faculty member Timothy Hyde. He will introduce the editors and panelists for tonight's event, but it falls to me, happily, to introduce him. If you wanted to invent a figure to represent the hybridity and the possibility of MIT architecture, the possibility in particular of words shaping the world just as much as bricks, you might invent Timothy. A licensed architect and former practitioner, he is a widely respected scholar of all the ways architecture has shaped modernity and vice versa. He's also an advocate and innovator in history's role in the present and the future, in particular through his role as a co-founder of the web-based Aggregate History Collective, for whom he helped edit the volume Governing by Design. His own books include Ugliness and Judgment on Architecture in the Public Eye and Constitutional Modernism, Architecture and Civil Society in Cuba from 1930 to 1959. While grounded in our history, theory, and criticism discipline group, he has chaired our department-wide SMARCS programs and regularly advises MArch design students as well. His work has been supported by a wide range of fellowships and grants, including his current sabbatical, during which time he has nevertheless remained an essential advisor and contributor to the department, particularly with events like tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce Timothy and have him welcome you and all of us to tonight's event. Thank you so much and welcome to MIT.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you everyone for joining us for the release of Thresholds 49 Supply. It's my privilege to be the faculty advisor for Thresholds, which is edited each year by students in the Department of Architecture. Editing an issue of the journal is an enormous undertaking of intellectual labor and logistical effort, and so it's exciting and rewarding to see each issue come to fruition and to get a first sight of the ideas it contains, as we will tonight. Thresholds was founded in 1992, released first as a monthly zine and then subsequently as an annual journal organized around specific themes. The format has changed over the past 30 years, but Thresholds has consistently been the venue for compelling and provocative thinking about the discourse of architecture and art. It is a peer-reviewed journal, highly regarded within the field, and broad and diverse both in its topics and in its roster of authors. From degree candidates to established scholars and artists, Thresholds has always sought out authors on the basis of the originality of their ideas and the rigor of their arguments. The issue that we'll celebrate tonight adds to this record. Thresholds 49 Supply is edited by two PhD students in the history, theory, and criticism of architecture and art, Nina Wechselblatt and Jack Hanley. Nina's research focuses on cybernetics and environmental systems in conceptual art in the 1960s and 70s. Jack's research focuses on the exchanges between environmental knowledge and spatial practices in the 20th century. I'm very grateful to Jack and to Nina for the intellectual commitment and editorial enthusiasm they've brought to this issue of the journal. It's been a pleasure to work with them both, and I've learned a great deal from them. I would like also to take a moment to thank the staff of the Department of Architecture, whose work contributes each year to the success of Thresholds. Amanda Moore, Melissa Vaughn, Kathleen Brearley, and Douglas Levy, and at the MIT Press and Olson. I would also like to express my gratitude to the members of the Thresholds Advisory Board, a group of 8 distinguished scholars at universities in the US, Canada, and in Europe who've given invaluable advice and support to the journal over the past few years. With that, let me turn over the proceedings to the real protagonists of this evening's events, the editors of Thresholds 49 Supply, Jack Hanley and Nina Wexelblatt.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Timothy, for the generous introduction, and thanks to everyone who's watching tonight. Jack and I are thrilled to celebrate the release of Thresholds 49 Supply this evening. Before we introduce the issue and tonight's presenters, we wanted to acknowledge the labor of the many people who made this issue possible. Special thanks to the staff of the MIT Department of Architecture, to Timothy Hyde and Amanda Moore, the Thresholds Advisory Board, our designer, Maria Candenoza, our manuscript editor, Patsy Bowdoin, Ann Olson at MIT Press, the editors of Thresholds 50, the anonymous peer reviewers who offered invaluable feedback on the scholarship in this issue, and of course, to all of the contributors, both those who are presenting tonight and those whose work you'll get to see in the issue itself. This has been a challenging year, to say the least, and we can't emphasize enough our gratitude for everyone who has drawn on their own supplies of energy to make this possible. And we also wanted to acknowledge our shared Zoom background, which adapts the cover image of the issue. The photograph was taken by Galen Pardy, one of tonight's presenters, as part of his research into sand supply chains in Singapore. We feel it captures the issue's emphasis on infrastructure, storage, and extractive economies, on movement and circulation, on abundance and scarcity, and that it also conveys the issue's lingering and ever-generative suspicion that something else is lying just around the corner in the story of supply.
To begin, supply is double-faced, both stockroom and stock ticker, fixity and liquidity, provision and the provisional. It feasts and fasts, circulates and hoards. It plans and revises and builds bulwarks against system failure, just in case. Art and architecture navigate supply as a play of scarcity and excess, but also of desire and necessity. Thresholds 49 asks a series of questions regarding these dialectics. What is produced when designers dream a world of infinite abundance? How do objects and spaces take shape in economies of scarcity? How have disruption and withdrawal marked the history of supply? And how could supply suggest nourishment as much as extraction? Reactionary discourses of supply-side economics tend to suggest that the endless proliferation of stuff just so happens to self-regulate. This issue argues to the contrary, that supply is an active, even diligent process. The issue also seeks to move beyond strictly materialist accounts of supply, understanding the interplay of the physical world and the virtual, intangible, or abstract vectors of information and meaning. Commodities and energy, of course, are central in this narrative. In William Cronin's History of the American Midwest, the development of spatial forms such as outhouses, silos, sheds, and fences provided the physical armature for accumulation of grain harvests. But when financial instruments transformed these stockpiles into stock futures, weather and climate became isomorphic to the volatility of markets. In other words, the provisioning of necessities became indistinguishable from information distributed across space and time. The past year has made these patterns unavoidable. Wild fluctuations in the stock market have accompanied the arrival of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the global economy shuttered and travel screeched to a standstill, the oil industry faced an especially potent disruption of its sustaining logics. In April 2020, the price of a barrel of West Texas Intermediate crude oil briefly dipped into negative territory. The laws of supply and demand here entered into a strange reversal, as producers found themselves on the other side of the deal, all while a matrix of futures contracts and derivatives instruments entangled the physical realities of resources. More recently, the blockage at the Suez Canal reveals the opposite tendency, as supply's abstraction gave way to the material and spatial realities of a hard and dumb analog world. Beyond power supply is the role of power in the history of supply. The foundations of logistical systems lie not only in an admixture of materiality and abstraction, but also of colonialism and expropriation. The violence in supply is inextricable from the legacy, or what Christina Sharp has called the wake, of the transatlantic slave trade. We think here of, for example, the infamous British ship Zong, from which enslaved Africans were thrown overboard to preserve water and collect insurance money, equating human lives to quantified financial and material supplies. In the realms of art and architecture, reparations for the specific legacies of slavery and empire are enmeshed in processes of redistribution and repatriation. The idiosyncrasies of the American electoral college system, itself devised to protect the power of white voters in slaveholding states, have shown that redistribution is as much a spatial phenomenon as it is economic. The lopsided power granted to less populated states makes equitable representation an always deferred goal. While populations veer towards the opportunities of cities, political systems lag behind their private counterparts in adjusting supply to meet demand. Yet supply is much more than the neutral management of material abundance. While the agents of supply have dreamt of abundance at any cost, they have also jealously guarded the right to scarcity. Similarly, Keller Easterling has called for a critical view of architectural subtraction as a tool of space making. Studying spatial deletions from demolition to vacancies acknowledges that the world is composed of absence as much as presence, and we must consider what it means to do without. The current health crisis is also a supply shock, and it has magnified the fact that supply does not always circulate from sites of greatest surplus to those of the greatest need. The variable abilities of providers to provide and receivers to receive are the long tails of historical categories that structure supply. Today, workers worldwide have been divided up as essential and non-essential, reinforcing old assumptions about the essence of work. The pandemic underscores that supply scales span the microbial and the planetary. Indeed, supply has long been a source of anxiety in conversations surrounding the climate crisis. Abundance and scarcity both run risks here. The 1971 Limits to Growth report, for example, made dire predictions of resource depletion that disguised a privileged imagining of hungry masses banging at the gates of development. Discourses of extractivism, on the other hand, reveal actors who would secure overproduction at the expense of contamination and dispossession, often of those already impacted by histories of oppression and colonial expropriation. With these themes in mind, the essays in this issue tackle the divergent political ends to which matters of scarcity and abundance are mobilized. By placing them in conversation, we aim ultimately to denaturalize the system known as supply and demand.
The issue is organized into 4 thematic sections that read supply like a narrative: extraction, distribution, storage, and interruption. At the heart of the publication, interrupting the flow from the second section to the third, is a supply catalog of short experimental essays related to supply's substances, systems, and tools. Extraction considers the removal and transformation of material from the earth. Gabriel Fuentes finds legacies of enslaved labor on colonial Cuban sugar plantations in energy production in the Revolutionary era. A roundtable conversation among Imani Jacqueline Brown, Charlotte Malter Bart, and Thea Rio Francos investigates extractivism from the perspectives of art, architecture, and activism. They excavate topics ranging from insidious chemicals in Louisiana to indigenous resistance in Ecuador to the politics of building with reclaimed materials. Veronica Smith combines a visual essay tracing the tower form in Los Angeles with an iridescent architectural program that makes overt the structures of oil extraction currently operating in the city. Distribution examines the networks through which supplies of all kinds circulate. Matthew Hockenberry's history of the commercial catalog argues that the medium conveys a promise of future availability. Michael Fassiju examines technical systems in the Bibliothèque Nationale that redefine the relationship between users of the library and its holdings. Larissa Guimaraes considers an unrealized network exhibition by Walter Zanini and Lina Bobardi, who attempted to democratize cultural access by sending art to remote Brazilian cities by train. If supplies can be on the move, storage takes the complementary impulse to contain, protect, or nurture them. Examining a real estate development constructed by 20th century Fox, Hao Chicha historicized land's utility as a store of value, finding the relationship between supply and demand in the housing market to be manipulable. A portfolio of Jumana Mana's sculptures reimagines rural Levantine grain containers at the human scale, installing these tools of nutritional preservation among the cool industrial grids of museum storage. The issue concludes not like an idealized Amazon Prime order with supplies delivered, but instead with interruption on the dangers and possibilities lying in supplies ruptures. Adam Longenbach revisits a historical precedent for our own virus-stricken urban landscapes, an episodic plague that upended New York's supply of horse-powered vehicles and spurred the city to rethink its transit system. Finally, Ash Moniz takes on labor within cargo shipping networks. They ask, when corporations care more about preventing inventory loss than minimizing danger to human life, how can laborers deploy their shared logistical literacy to reclaim power? The 6 contributors presenting their work tonight span these 4 sections. Photogrammetry by Galen Pardee connects sand stockpiles in Singapore to international supply chains. Bin Li's account of an alpine mountain range in China traces botanical specimens circulating to collections around the globe. 3 design proposals by Jessie Le Cavalier rework the banal efficiency of just-in-time logistics into projects based in support, provision, and indeterminacy. The artwork of Gina Valentine questions the limits of knowledge available from databanks about Black life, at times even causing that data to eat away at itself. Sophia Stamatopoulou-Robbins discusses the line between private and public in her fieldwork with a Greek refugee housing project. And finally, a manifesto by the Office of Uncertainty Research, tonight represented by Mark Jarzenbeck, explodes the construction of a modernist house into scales both atomic and cosmic. Across mediums and disciplines, each contributor casts a critical eye on the distributions of power that circumscribe whose demands are recognized as legitimate and what it means to properly address a need. Jack and I are thrilled that these 6 can join us this evening to examine the designs and histories of supply and to imagine other shapes for necessity, demand, and fulfillment. So let's get into it.
Galen Pardee is a designer, educator, and researcher, and is currently the Lefebvre Emerging Practitioner Fellow at The Ohio State University. He received his BA from Brandeis University and his MArch from Columbia University Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. He has taught at Columbia University and Ohio State and designed projects in New York City and California. His studio drawing agency explores dimensions of architectural advocacy, material economy, and expanded practice. Thank you, Galen.
Thank you, Jack. First of all, I'd just like to say thanks to you and to Nina for the invitation to contribute, and of course, your advice and support along the way. I'd also like to thank, before I begin, just very quickly, the Graham Foundation's support for the field research that supported this article, and my wonderful colleagues in Singapore, New York, and here in Ohio. So the piece I'm going to present very briefly is called Dunescape Urbanism, or the Stockpiles of Sand Geopolitics. And this piece explores the unique relationship between Singapore and sand, and the ways that these relationships are sort of made manifest and legible in the city-state and beyond. So if we go to the next slide, please. So much of the sand trade is quite hard to visualize. This is sort of the the beginning of the issue. It's difficult to visualize, yet at once quite present. So what you're looking at is the Tampines sand stockpile, which is part of the Singaporean Strategic Sand Reserve, which is towering over the trees here in a otherwise residential neighborhood. If we go to the next slide. To zoom in, so this is the same stockpile. Tampines is, as I mentioned, one of 3 of these strategic reserves located throughout the city-state. And Dunescape urbanism attempts to use architectural visualization and remote sensing to understand the genesis and capacities of these facilities. This is because the sand trade has become quite sensitive, and official government records don't list any information, origins, quantities, and access, as you can see, is quite prohibited. This is a barbed wire fence. There are security cameras. There's a guard booth a little bit further to the right of the image here. So if we go to the next slide, the reason why I say Singapore has a unique relationship to sand is because Singapore actually imports almost every grain of sand and aggregate it uses. And we'll get into that in a minute. But first of all, I think it's important to understand, where these things are. So this is Singapore. You can see there are 2 sort of red boxes. You have Punggol and Seletar, which are sort of on the northeastern side of the island. And then Tampines, the one we were looking at, is fairly centrally located. So if we go to the next slide, this is just a quick graph to sort of trace the official counts, let's say, of Singapore's sand imports. And what's interesting to understand here is that this international reliance has left them quite exposed to the political externalities of this trade. So sand mining can be quite harmful if it's not regulated. It's also important to understand that sand is a non-renewable material, at least construction grade sand, that is. And so there's a sort of like overlapping of values here in the Southeast Asian region, which is leaving Singapore at the mercy of its trade partners who inevitably decide that either the economic, environmental, or geopolitical downsides of selling sand to a prosperous neighbor outweigh the benefits. So what this graph shows is basically every major trade partner that Singapore has ever had has at some point banned sand trades. Now, the existence of this graph also proves that this has not been an impediment. There are a lot of other complicating factors to try and capture the sand trade. But what I really wanted to focus on with this project is how we can sort of use Singapore itself as a kind of independent variable to read these stockpiles and start to understand just at a sort of relative scale the kind of international ties that these sand dunes have with the rest of the world. So if we go next, the reason sand is such a big part of the construction industry in Singapore is actually because of a labor condition. So many construction workers, I'd say most construction workers in Singapore are actually themselves immigrants, and many times from the same places that are exporting sand. And work visas, by and large, only last 2 years. So concrete is a material of convenience for the construction industry because it's relatively simple to teach, moves fairly quickly, and that means that contracting offices don't have to spend a lot of time teaching their employees complicated construction techniques. They can sort of get them in the field and keep things moving. So this is a complex of buildings in Singapore. You can see they are entirely concrete. And so this reliance on concrete is really a sort of function of the labor market in many ways. And so it's a sort of, it's not just that they could shift to, using CLT or steel overnight. So as we move to the next slide here, these we're just going to flip through fairly quickly. It's a series of these sort of reconstructions, digital reconstructions of each of the 3 sand stockpiles. And so the way these work is I developed a digital drawing machine that can read satellite data, create sort of generalized topographic models. When you cross-reference those models against the available statistics for imports, you can start to get a sense of the likely origins of the sand. So so to sort of move through chronologically here, for example, this is the Tampines stockpile shown here in 1997. This is in the aftermath of Malaysia's ban on sand exports, which was kind of the first of these. So now if we advance again, this time, yeah, so now we're in July. Oh, sorry, I think we jumped ahead a little too far. Okay, well, so that's Punggol. This is a this is a second stockpile. This one was started in 2007, and if we go to the next slide here, yeah, you can see 2 years later. It's a little harder to see on this one, but it has expanded somewhat. Now, if we go to the next slide, you can see here, now we're on to Selitar, which is actually the largest of the 3 stockpiles. And so if we advance again, you can see a dark blue set of sand dunes start to come into place. And then if we advance a final time, we'll see a yellow sand dune. So again, what this is meant to show is that each of these colors represents so let's hold on this one. Each of these colors represents a sort of distinct probable origin. So yellow being Cambodia, light blue being Vietnam, and dark blue being Indonesia. So now if we go ahead again, the next slide. Right, so those were fairly rough. What we've been able to do now that we have those kind of rough 3D models is using some photogrammetry from photos I took, like the one that is the background here, of these 3 sites. You can actually start to sort of create relatively accurately scaled models. And so the findings here are basically that moving from the left side of the screen, Punggol, to the right, we start to arrive at some sort of rough capacity estimates here. So Punggol holds 3.58 million cubic meters of sand, Selitar 7.78 million, and Tampines on the far left here, 6.45 million. To take Tampines as an example, if you were to explode these 4 sand dunes, that sand could cover Central Park in a layer 1 granule deep. And so to conclude and go to the next slide here, again, while these are rough calculations and figures, again, the goal of this exercise is to establish the scale and impacts of a single material flow. Sand is a reminder that today's construction sites are tips of multinational icebergs of production. If you know anybody who's tried to renovate a kitchen in the last year, you know this to be true. As materials move across borders, the politics of stability, security, and stockpiling will become more commonplace, increasing the embodied costs of scarce materials. Singapore's dunescape urbanism provides a window into the price of construction when logistics and politics collide. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. Next, we'll hear from Bin Lee, who is an architect, landscape architect, and assistant professor at the School of Architecture, the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing. She's the founder of Office Transect, a design collaborative that draws in sectional design research of architecture, landscape, and geomorphology across scales and geographies. She taught at, and very soon will be defending her PhD from, the Oslo School of Architecture and Design, and she holds an MArch from MIT.
Thank you, Nina, for this very kind introduction. And also thank you, Jack, for this very nice work at turning this issue of threshold 49 supply The idea of this essay I contributed called The Global Archive, What an Alpine Geography Supplies. This idea is from part of my PhD design research at Oslo School of Architecture and Design, looking at the changing landscapes of alpine geographies in China and in Europe. There are high mountains covered with ice, glaciers, and alpine vegetations. They are the geographies very sensitive to climate change and to urbanization process. Let's go to the next slide, please. Next slide. When I zoom in further and explore more on a specific case, Mount Gongga, located in southwest China, I was amazed by how a local mountain has been well connected to climate-controlled archives around the globe from the early 20th century, and in nowadays perform as an open-air archive institute, forming a multi-layer supplies of knowledge and experiences over 100 years. And in this sense, it expands the idea of archive from just an architectural one to a geographical one. And this, from this slide on, I would like to kind of jump between early 20th century and nowadays, historical and contemporary, to explain this kind of two ideas or connected ideas of archives. And this is the drawing, sectional drawing I did, and then related to a early expectation did by cartographer Eduard Imhoff from ETH Zurich, and to show that sectionally the bioclimatic belts of Gongga, as well as the different lines of it, the settlement line, the tree line, and the snow lines. The next slide, please. And this is nowadays that we see how people standing at 4,000 meters above sea level, looking at the summit of Gongga. And then this really staged the mountain as a archive institute to see the glacial runoff from the summit down to the glacial terminus. Let's go to next slide, please. And this is when researchers, including me, walk around the mountain and along the different research routes, and then to see different parts of the mountain containing the knowledge of vegetation and glacial retreat, as well as hydropower infrastructure and energy. Next slide. And this transect drawing showing the previous routes that how from the valley to the peak of each route. Next slide. And jumping back to around 1930s, and this is still the group from ETH Zurich, and they made this expedition to Gongga. And then this is the journal from geologist Arno Heim, and this volume is now stored at ETH University Archive. So being able to sitting within a climate control archive and looking at how a mountain has been experienced since from over almost 100 years ago is quite a juxtaposition with what we experience nowadays. And next slide. And then to kind of contrast to what early explorer bring to Gongga, to document, and this is what contemporary researchers, including myself, and bringing visual tools such as drone as well as other tools to document this mountain. Next slide. And then now we see like the mountain is constantly changing. And nowadays we see this at the glacial terminus, this process of glacial retreat is happening at the same time with planned succession. Next slide. And then jump back to the 1929. We see these are the specimens collected from the mountain by Joseph Rock and found and transported to the Harvard Beharin archive and then stored there. Next slide. And we see that the specimen from Massachusetts continued to transport it to Edinburgh and then to store at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh. And then we'll see like nowadays how the archival space look like to store those specimens from this seemingly remote mountain. Next slide. And at Edinburgh, we also see photos from Joseph Rock, photographed this peak, high mountain peak the first time. And then we see this, how much the glacier was back to then. And then this losing glacier have been kind of freezed because of the architectural archive. They are freeze and then be able for us to dig into what it looked like before. Next slide. And then this is nowadays, this is a collage I made to kind of show that how nowadays the glacial flow and then also the runoffs and how that connected to the hydropower infrastructure constructed at lower elevation. And then this like this constant changing of water energy in a sense. And then this also linked to the disappearing of ice, of course. And next one, please. And then to conclude my this presentation, this is a speculative drawing and also an idea my student Jacob Wood proposed in a studio that related to study this high mountain. Basically, his idea is to geolocate a sound installation at different parts of the glaciers in Gongga from nowadays, and then the sound recorded can be kind of broadcast to a broader audience in urban areas, so they know that the glacial retreat is happening, and then in 50 years, those installations will become the measures or the marks on the geography. And then this is the last slides of my sharing. And then thank you for listening to it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Jesse Le Cavalier explores the architectural and urban implications of contemporary infrastructure. He's the author of The Rule of Logistics, Walmart and the Architecture of Fulfillment, and is associate professor at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture at the University of Toronto, where he directs the PhD program. Previously, he was the Daniel Rose Visiting Assistant Professor at the Yale School of Architecture and a Sanders Fellow at the University of Michigan. His work has been exhibited at the Seoul Biennial, the Oslo Triennial, and the Museum of Modern Art.
Thanks, Jack. And thanks to MIT and to Thresholds for the invitation. Congratulations to you and to Nina on what seems to be a really exciting issue. And for me, it's a major honor to be able to contribute to it. And also, I'm really grateful for the occasion to be able to think about some of these issues amongst such great company. And for me, it was a chance to try to kind of think through some design projects that I've been working on in this context of these larger questions of supply. And so the title borrows from John Harwood's exploration of Ruskin's distinction between architectures of protection and architectures of position, which he translates and can understand more generally as architectures of logistics or of even of infrastructure more broadly. Next slide, please. But I thought, given the title of the issue, it might be interesting to begin with one of the most common metaphors of logistics, the supply chain. This was first used in a Booz Allen report. They were a management consulting firm in the early 80s, in which the concept of what they described as a, quote, integrated supply chain was developed as a way of managing stock and dealing with the challenges of distribution. And so reported here by the Financial Times, they described the supply chain as, quote, the sequence of events that occur from after the procurement of raw material through to the delivery of the final customer. We just saw this from Galen's presentation, there's really, the supply chain extends far backward beyond just procurement of raw material. And also anyone with a smartphone, we know that the attention economy extends the relationships of these things far forward past mere delivery. Next, please. We also, of course, know that the supply chain is far from the frictionless networks of global circuitry that the industry would have us believe. It's brittle, it's vulnerable, it's subject to disruption by, windstorms, or as we just heard about, the demand shock of pandemic-driven hoarding. So the supply chain is far from robust, and it's also, of course, by the way, not a chain. Next, please. If we look around at architecture firms who are working on logistical buildings, we might take from that the concerns have to do with optimizing throughput, reducing surface area to volume ratios, making built reproductions more efficient. But if logistics is about control of distribution and access to resources, about who gets what, how, and on what schedule, then it's a field that concerns all of us. So I used the article to suggest and to kind of work through some ideas about how logistics has its own formal and organizational properties, but identifying them as such doesn't lead us then to design quote unquote better buildings in pursuit of global circulation of materials and products. But instead, I think to the extent that we can learn from logistics, it's to learn that architecture and urbanism have little to offer the field as it's presently constituted. Next, please. So rather than regulating flows of capital, as an architecture of position might do, we might ask how architectures of provision could come about. If the logistics industry exists at the intersection of global circulation and organized violence, as Deb Cowan has persuasively argued, and if the spatial manifestations of those practices continue to be built within a corresponding system of values, then theorizing a logistical architecture or a kind of alternative logistical architecture offers possibilities for claiming it as a space of design first, but with the goal of asserting an alternative set of values and related forms as a result. So to study these buildings is to become receptive to the obscured forces that condition them. In other words, the aesthetics of logistics are not in their apparent architectural envelope, but in their performance as components within a larger set of systems. Next, please. So what follows are just three images of three projects. And Barry, if you don't mind maybe clicking on the gray window to start the animation. As you know, the logistics industry, is associated with lean operations and just-in-time approaches to delivery, which means that things don't accumulate. There's a certain idea about a kind of tightness of all of this. But in order to make that happen, there's this incredible amount of slack and surplus. And so there are these sort of vast quantities of material reserves sitting in wait, ready to accommodate the fluctuating stock that scales up quickly or correspondingly retracts. And so for the 2018 MoMA PS1 program, my office, we developed a proposal that took hundreds of these industrial pallet racks to create this kind of prototype for a temporary public space using a series of aisles and cross aisles and selective removals to develop what we were thinking of as a kind of enchanted forest of logistics. Next, please. The logistics industry, it's an art of uncertainty. It involves constant management and reorganization of systems in motion and in perpetual obsolescence. So in this an urban design proposal, we used surplus steel slag that was weathered and detoxified and then redirected to the site and shaped into a constantly evolving set of landforms that support a wide range of uses but don't overdetermine them. The project takes advantage of a material abundance to create a landscape in motion that simulates, or that was intended to simulate natural landscapes, but in practice, but not necessarily in form. And our goal, in a way, was to de-instrumentalize the apparent indeterminacy of something like Amazon robotics to generate part of the city that's both active and absurd. Finally, the last slide, next please. This is a project in the New Jersey Meadowlands that, with the working title, The Natures of Logistics, it posits a latent infrastructural vernacular that is capable of addressing the polluted conditions of the Meadowlands by embracing the conflicting forms of the place while also generating its own collection of minor civic forms through a kind of remediation process that engages this nature that's not one of wilderness nor of agriculture, but something more wild, and as a result, I think also logistical. So with these projects, we've been trying to draw out the tensions that are latent in logistical forms to separate them from their role in supply and redirect them towards support. So in other words, away from position and toward provision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesse. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Gina Valentine, who's a mother, a visual artist, and associate professor of print media at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She's also co-founder with artist Heather Hart of Black Lunch Table, an oral history archiving project. Her work involves language translation, mining content from material and digital archives, and experimental strategies for humanizing data visualization. Her work has received recognition and support from the Graham Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and Art Matters, among others. And she received her BFA from Carnegie Mellon and her MFA from Stanford University.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nina, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for the invitation to collaborate with you on Thresholds and to share my work with you today. So as the slide says, I am Gina Valentine. I wear the many hats of artist, writer, professor, and mother. And I'm going to share with you some recent and ongoing projects, which includes motherhood. Next slide. So this is my little dude. In February 2013, I gave birth to this incredible human, my son, Sylvan. Next. The socio-critical element in my work is largely inspired by him and his perennially posed why. As events unfolding in national and international politics have compelled me to react, I find myself having to distill things like white supremacy into 8-year-old terms. Next. Such distillation or translation requires a re-examination of the factors that determine my socio-political positionality. It demands a continual recalibration of meaning a priori and of my position in this world. Next. One such work was inspired by my inability to empathize with mothers who've lost their children to state violence. I cannot imagine losing my own son, nor can I conjure the language to explain these deaths to him. So reaching the limit of what is comprehensible, the words in the relentless newspaper accounts I read become abstracted into pure form. Next. So this piece, Explication du texte, examines the idea of close reading in a manner that is both to the letter and tongue-in-cheek. Next. In an effort to make sense of the killings of unarmed Black people, we discuss news media accounts of these events. We attempt something like a close reading. Yet discursive analysis finds its limits here, as it fails to reconcile the space between sympathy and empathy. Next. So to construct this piece, I photographed the phrase "shot my son" as it appeared in the New York Times under a confocal microscope. Next. The final image is composed of hundreds of microscope scans pieced together again and printed as a newspaper. 2,000 copies have been printed to be exhibited and given away. Next. To construct this next piece, Apparatic Almanac, I examined data showing which US cities had the highest rates of deadly encounters with police among Black men in 2015. Next. For the most part, these are also the cities with the highest homicide rates overall. And so each city is assigned a month in the almanac according to which month had the highest homicides. Next. I then looked at weather data to determine the hottest day of the month and located weather reports in the local newspapers accounting the forecast for that day. Next. The piece compares the frequency of horrific news accounts with the frequency and modulation of weather reporting. Next. It's every day the same thing, but different. Next. An almanac is historically kept to provide reference to various industries on climate futures in a particular region. Next. It's useful to consider how an almanac of the dead might function. Next. I wanted to make something that would catalyze conversation. Next. Everyone talks about the weather. Next. Everyone should also talk about gun violence, state violence. Next. And the climate in regards to the fact that it's changing. Next. And about the disconnect that exists between statistical data related to social and environmental phenomena. Next. And the lived experience of this world. Next. Literacy test Rorschach is a series of 35 drawings that examine the shapes of the nation's most severely gerrymandered districts. Next. Gerrymandering is a process by which electoral districts are redrawn to give one political party advantage over the other. Next. This series is named for the district's resemblance to Rorschach inkblot tests. Next. And the title, of course, also refers to Jim Crow literacy tests, which required Black citizens to run a gauntlet of inane trials in order to qualify for voter registration. Next. These laws conspicuously and brazenly prevented Black people from exercising their right to vote. Next. I consider the voting laws being pushed through in Georgia and around the country in the past week. Next. Stacey Abrams calls this legislation Jim Crow in a suit and tie. Next. Next. Another project on gerrymandering examines the redrawing of district lines from the state's ratification to the present day. This series, called Fault Lines, focuses on the 9 states formerly protected by the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The state's forms were painted with iron gall ink on paper that I made from a hand-sewn cotton quilt. Next. I drew a composite of all the district lines of each state, kind of on the reverse of the paper, in high concentrate hydrogen peroxide, which accelerates the oxidization and eats the paper beneath. Oxidizing or rusting the ink produces sulfuric acid, which of course eats the paper. And so the process, therefore, is a metaphor for the destabilization of our democracy via district district redrafting. And so you can kind of see in this image that there are lines where the paper is starting to fall apart. Next. I first encountered W.E.B. Du Bois's exhibition of American Negroes data visualizations as I was finishing up the Almanac series. At the time, I had been wondering if straightforward illustrations of weather data could be read as beautiful, and I happened upon this work. I was particularly drawn to these drawings because they're at once beautiful, simple, modernist drawings and plainly legible data visualizations of Black life of that era. Next. The original drawings intended to redefine the image of the American Negro, countering the popular, reductive, and racist portrayals of Black people with data collected and illustrated by Black people, and offering a more accurate, nuanced, and humanizing understanding. These illustrations highlighted Black achievement, making a case for community investment and inclusion. Next. For Exhibit of American Negroes Revisited, I am recreating Du Bois's set of 67 drawings using contemporary data on the lives of Black people living in America. My project retains a composition, aesthetic, and areas of inquiry of the originals, illuminating how new data changes the drawing's forms. 100 years after the originals were created, my project asks what parallels exist between historic and contemporary systems of oppression and support for Black Americans. While much of my demographic research is fairly straightforward, the work of reassigning oppressive or supportive institutional and social classifications is most interesting. Next. For example, updating demographics related to family wealth, education, and land ownership is important, as is replacing enslaved with incarcerated and sharecropper with underemployed. Such research raises questions not explicitly illustrated in the data. What goods are manufactured using prison labor? And what is the economic status of those prisoners' families and communities? Who is doing that work and who is benefiting? And who controls the means of production? Next. The execution of and results from the much anticipated 2020 census will significantly affect the distribution of resources and the shape of this country. And I have to admit, I imagined that undertaking demographic research in 2020 would be a much simpler task than it has been, than it was 100 years, or than it would be 100 years since Du Bois's project. Of course, the tools and technology to conduct, document, and publish or make accessible census data are far more sophisticated and the results more comprehensive. There is greater accountability for accuracy in collecting statistical data on Black people in America, and much of this data is publicly available via the online census database. I believe what will be revealed in my remake is the lingering and persistent effects of institutional racism, white supremacy, and the prioritization of capitalism over common good. Next. I'm hopeful that my ongoing process of research and material exploration will inspire additional research in online and offline archives and will lead to discoveries of data I'd not imagined I'd find, and that creating illustrations of these various data sets will produce some unexpected results along the way. Next. As history is not static, the interpretations of data, objects, narratives are also fluid and ever-changing. The exhibition of my drawings is being conceived with the hope that it will center conversation amongst publics and inspire additional engagement with local archives, generating a constellation of related future inquiries. In this series and in all of my work, I attempt to reconcile the difference between data illustrations and the realities they reference, with the intention to foster nuanced and alternative understandings of socio-political phenomena and to inspire compassionate associations with the communities and individuals affected by or generative of these phenomena. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Sophia Stalmatopoulou-Robbins is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Bard College, with interests in infrastructure, waste, environment, colonialism, austerity, and platform capitalism. Her first book, Waste Siege: The Life of Infrastructure in Palestine, won the Middle East Studies Association's Albert Hourani Book Award. Her current book, Homing Austerity: Airbnb in Athens, examines how Airbnb and austerity are together transforming the relationship between subjectivity, real estate, labor, and aesthetics.
Thank you so much, Jack and Nina and Thresholds and MIT. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I have to say, listening to everyone's presentations just makes me that much more excited to be part of this group and honored. So next slide, please. Making supply first requires making that which is to be supplied perceptible to the supplier. In other words, provisioning requires the dual process of apprehending and objectifying that which is to form supply's content. This is one way that platform-mediated home sharing intervenes upon housing supply. Much of the critical attention that has gone to Airbnb has demonstrated how it diminishes housing supply. For instance, Airbnb reduces housing for long-term residents by making it into temporary short-term housing for tourists, which is a lucrative asset for landlords. Yet observations of Airbnb and similar platforms have tended to black box the process of making and transforming supply. Opening that box reveals not only the originary moment, apprehension, as a critical step in how home sharing platforms shape prospects for housing supply, it also helps explain more generally the processes by which supply is created. So drawing on fieldwork I conducted in Greece beginning in 2017, my essay examines one case in which two private corporations, Airbnb and AirDNA, which is a data scraping company that sells short-term rentals data to investors, came under consideration by government and humanitarian actors as tools for providing refugee housing. Greece has become a passageway and home to tens of thousands of refugees in the past 5 years, especially. Housing the refugees in long-term housing outside of camps has been one of the major challenges for the Greek government. Next slide, please. I tell the story of how a small urban refugee relocation program, which I call Finding Home, contemplated using Airbnb and AirDNA as vehicles for making unoccupied Airbnb listings apprehensible to itself. Finding Home estimated that the number of vacant homes in the city was considerable, but the Greek state lacked data on where such properties were, to whom they belonged, and how many of them there were. Though the homes were materially present in that they stood empty, they were functionally unavailable. Vacant housing could not be turned into actual supply, a transferable reserve, in other words, to be given to those in need, until the state was made aware that it existed. Much like underground oil or water, the presence and location of available housing units could be imagined, but their exploitation required certain tools of extraction. Finding Home toyed with the idea of using AirDNA to find failed Airbnb listings in order to apprehend potential housing supply in spite of these closed doors, solid walls, and undocumented housing status that made it an invisible resource. Finding Home ended up finding long-term housing for just under 200 refugees otherwise, especially by allowing refugees to find their own rentals through their own networks in the city. But I think the story of the near use of AirDNA to unlock a hidden housing supply through Airbnb nevertheless shows us three things. One, it offers insights into how housing supply can operate in the absence of an all-seeing state. Two, it reveals what I see as an emergent relationship between humanitarianism and platform capitalism. And three, it demonstrates the volatile ways in which the failures of startup industries can be captured to produce supply and capitalist value while intervening upon conditions of governance and urban livability. While the public good of housing was on the brink of becoming corporatized through Airbnb and AirDNA, these private corporations were also nearly appropriated to supply that public good. Next slide, please. I also think that although Finding Home did not ultimately use Airbnb and AirDNA to make housing apprehensible, the proposal to do so helps us think about the concept of supply in general, and more specifically how platform-mediated home sharing, like that promoted by Airbnb, can be understood to intervene in supply. Anthropology has tended to think about supply in the context of commodity and other supply chains within global capitalist exchange as processes, including labor, by which materials or services being supplied are produced and conveyed from supplier to demander. More recently, supply has been central to studies of infrastructure and anthropology as source of or impediment to the supply of life-sustaining resources. Many have pointed to the ways in which understandings of supply, that is, how great a supply there is, can underpin entire political systems. I'm thinking here of Israel-Palestine. The Airbnb AirDNA story in Greece highlights additional processes by which materials or services can be brought into being. It shows how a technology designed to supply one type of product can be mobilized against itself to generate another, arguably opposite type of supply. Here, elements of a state bureaucracy sought to mobilize a technology to circumvent that bureaucracy's own shortcomings. Their idea was to harness the dual failures of financial capital, manifest in unoccupied Airbnb units, and state surveillance, manifest in missing data, to generate the possibility of a public good, which was long-term refugee housing, that was not on offer through conventional channels, either of humanitarian governance or political mobilization. So Airbnb's existence as an exploiter of space through financial capital also generated the possibility for new political imaginaries that departed both from the dominant logics of Airbnb and the state. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sophia. And our final presenter is Mark Jarzenbeck, who is a professor of the history and theory of architecture here at MIT. He works on a wide range of topics, both historical and theoretical. His publications include A Global History of Architecture with co-author Vikram Prakash and illustrator Francis D.K. Ching, Architecture of First Societies, A Global Perspective, and Digital Stockholm Syndrome in the Post-Ontological Age. In 2018, he and Vikram Prakash founded OUR, the Office for Uncertainty Research, and the two are co-authors on the text published in Thresholds.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the editors, Jack and Nina, for the opportunity to publish this material. What we see here in the slide is actually a little movie. I'm not sure if it's running or not. If there's any way to get it to run. Yeah. Vikram Prakash, who teaches at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I first thought of doing this project. We didn't really anticipate how complex and how rewarding it would be. We took a recently completed, modest, small, modern house and asked, where did everything come from? It is such an easy question that we were surprised that it had not been posed already. It is not a hard question to answer, for we all know that the answer lies in the flows of global economy and all that that means. But our point was not to cheat and go straight to the answer, but to do the actual homework. We had all the documents, the contracts about the house. We knew the owner, we knew the architects, and had about as much access to information as anyone could expect. Our analysis moved along 4 axes: atoms, ingredients, labor, and sources. One of the things we learned was how little all of that documentation helped. Even the contracts for the construction of the house were often verbal, maybe on the order of 80%, and probably not much different than a building site during the Roman Empire. And of course, once we got into shipping and sourcing, there things really got cloudy. Some information was not known because it was wrapped up in corporate secrecy. Some was not known because it was simply not recorded. Some was certainly associated with illegal mining and the like. We live in an information age, but the truth is that it is completely mythological. We have dangerously objectified our own illusions. We discovered that even when something was known to be sourced as sustainable, like the oak flooring from the forest in southern Germany, it was to mislead us into thinking that way. Few of the materials in the house that went under the category of sustainable proved to be so. So we had to dodge the misdirects, but also to interpolate over the absences, interpret and fabricate to fill in all the gaps. And I would probably say that we got maybe a third of the way through, but it doesn't really matter. Our intention was not to focus on some magically complete story of supply, but to point out that the supply chain begins and ends in stories that are incomplete, incompletable, and often very uncertain. The story begins actually in the Big Bang, and more importantly, with the supernova. And Barry, if you could just go ahead and click next slide every 15 seconds, that'd be great. So all this, yeah, just Barry. Yeah, you can just go to click the next slide, please, and just go for 15 seconds. All the steel in the house came from a supernova some 8 billion years ago, with iron making its way via asteroids and the like to the Earth. So in a sense, the universe was the first fabrication and delivery mechanism. It was your lucky day if you could get an asteroid fall on your property, the amount of rare earth materials that it contains. The concrete and sand made from rocks that were fabricated in the earth some billions of years ago, ground to sand, unusable for concrete, only maybe in the last 100,000 years or so. But this was for us more than just some empirical factuality, but part of the hope for awareness that even a house like this was something magical about it. And magic not necessarily drawn on the ontology, also drawn on the ontology of atomic forces. And here we relied on Karen Barad. This little house is made from stardust, and yet we treat it, like most architecture today, like just another arbitrary product. We also wanted to demonstrate that it was not just global and made out of the universe, but reached even into the building that was designed by the 4 architects, a tall and tiny firm, who could mastermind the compression of realities, labor, and material. It'd be quite impossible for this 15 years ago without computers and network systems. There can be no doubt that the architects were riding the wave of neoliberal economy. So we wanted to expose the complex dark side of that. We wanted to expose how buildings like this had to address the illegal mining of sand that Colin had studied, the insecticide that was used in Indonesia to kill the bugs for the trees that were used for the flooring, the chromium that poisoned the people in Japan for the steel, and so on. The incredible chemicalization of materials of the last 3 decades was a sort of a shock to us. The plastic was everywhere, even on the surface of the steel. So what was the backstory of the house? Turns out to be a story of humans, global networks, all the way up to the scale of the globes, universe, and molecules. Most people would think that architects might know the story, but in truth, they are completely ignorant of it as a general public. So we wanted to remind ourselves of the strange inversion that is at play when we begin to poke at the modern idea of a modern architecture. While the possibility of intelligibility is presented throughout the profession and the discipline, promised in the very word research, even if it is the precondition of intelligibility, the house was a signifier of architecture itself, seeks to preserve the secret that is at its core of its very sense of modernity, the mythic violence, productivity that makes it possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mark, and thank you to all of our presenters. We have a bit of time for a discussion, and I think we are accepting audience questions on our various platforms, but we'll begin with a few questions that Jack and I have for all of you. So to start, we wanted to talk about history, the place of history. And while much of the scholarship in the issue is explicitly historical in nature, we were interested to put all of you in conversation because each of you consciously imbues contemporary supply with legacies of social, environmental, racial, colonial, other distributions and differentials of power. So against the demands of an industry that, as Jesse pointed out, imagines itself on a timescale called just in time, in what ways do we or can we grapple with or make manifest histories of supply in the present?
You got to probably have to call on individual people and, to sort of break the damn mute crisis. Well, I love the papers. I love, being embedded in this conversation. And I think what we're obviously seeing is many different types of histories, are needed and required. We have, in some sense, a sort of a standard histories that come out of history of technology, history of economy, history of capitalism, and so forth. But there are all sorts of histories, that are more narrative in scope, and that we haven't even begun to really extract or think about or talk about. And so I think we're just sort of at the beginning of a conversation about how history can work, and maybe even history may not be the right word anymore, at some level, because, what we also need are, let's say journalistic practices, that we're not trying to make history as such. We first got to, challenge the logic of discursive foreclosure against knowledge, and that can come in force of history at some level, but of course of discursive practices or other types of activism, as we've seen with Gina.
Mark, I love the way that you phrase the way we objectify our own mythologies in this dangerous way, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to point to the origin of the phrase supply chain, because of the ways that I think these things that are kind of in a way historical accidents, or a product of some kind of in this case corporate consulting and some room somewhere, become totally internalized and naturalized and perpetuate these things. So like flow does the same thing, I think, where these systems become imagined as kind of natural, and so that kind of the way they get fixed into a kind of broader discourse beyond a specialized one then perpetuates certain kinds of things, or allows us to conveniently obscure them over and over and over again.
I really was excited to hear what you all had to say in response to this question, so I didn't immediately unmute. But the first thing that popped into my head was just thinking about, our responsibility as, well, maybe it's not a responsibility, but the role of artists to engage a broader public in the conversations that are related and that affect these lives in very real ways. Like, so all these phenomena affect these lives in very real ways. I was thinking about a project that is not my own, but that I admire, which is Tonika Johnson's Folded Map project, which is here in Chicago. And she matches people on the north and south ends of the city that live at the north number of that address with the south number of that address. And of course, like, Chicago is an historically segregated city. So I'm bringing two people or two families that normally wouldn't have interacted together to talk about, how I could bring this back around to supply, how their lives are common, what they share, and what disparities exist. And I was also just thinking about Black Lunch Table, which I didn't actually talk about, but it's a series of roundtable conversations that are recorded with community members, and they talk about, socio-political issues related to life in their community. And yeah, I think that's all. I don't have an end point.
I really liked, Mark, this sort of call for, say, like a journalistic kind of approach. And I think this is something that I've thought about a lot as well, just in terms of like what a quote unquote practicing architect is supposed to take away from any of this stuff. And in a lot of ways, I think the sort of understanding of lineages and history and the question of what is on a site currently versus what is maybe meant to be brought there, I think is really critical. And I mean, I'm glad that a practice like Lacaton and Basel won the Pritzker just a few weeks ago, because I think sort of shifting the prestige of architectural production away from something that's like a sort of bespoke house to maybe a sort of especially dexterous, rehabilitation of an existing structure, or, a reuse of a kind of material is actually maybe more of where the industry should be right now. I mean, it would be an interesting sort of provocation, I think, to practicing architects to sort of have them be both progressive but backwards facing at the same time from a material perspective and an embodied carbon perspective, especially. I think that could probably be helpful to the industry, but that's I don't know if that's history, but that's where I stand on it.
Well, I mean, the other issue that I'd be curious to hear people talk about is, let's say like the studio. This is something for, let's say, history, theory, criticism people, to work on, but really it should be something in the studio, right? These should be activities, projects. They should have an impact on studio teaching, studio culture, and student professors are not ignorant of many of the issues, out there, but, I don't see much of a direct line of thought between sort of, let's say, an acknowledgement to an actual sort of studio culture. That's where I think we should turn some energy to, to challenge the studio world.
Well, that might be a good segue, Mark, into our next question that we would pose to everyone. And many of you are artists, image makers, and designers. Sophia, our resident anthropologist here, interested in culture. And we're wondering, what's the place of aesthetics in studying supply? And what opportunities or challenges does working with aesthetics bring to this field of supply that we're all in?
Aesthetics, as such? Well, that's a tough question.
I mean, I share Gina's enthusiasm to hear everyone else, so I'm reluctant to start, but just because, but maybe I'll jump in. Partly, I think for me, one of the challenges in being both sort of fascinated by these things that I also find grotesque is, it's like a methodological problem, because I'm totally fascinated by them at a kind of, at a level of pleasure, but then I'm also like totally repelled by what they mean. And so it's confusing. And so I've been trying to figure out how to make sense of that. And one of the ways that has been liberating for me is to try to understand the kind of looseness between them, or the gaps between the kind of possibilities of, what we might think of as being much more tightly coupled relationships between, let's say, like the form of something and what it does. And so I think for me, the efforts to try to get out of, to reframe some of the questions of value, and to change the kind of, like to Mark's question, like the studio dynamic around a kind of problem solving approach is inadequate, I think, to address these issues, because it's not about, I think somehow it's like engaging it by not engaging it. So I think working in parallel, or I think finding some way of not hitting, like addressing it so directly or in a kind of binary way, but so I think that's for me what that's why I'm grateful for the chance here, because it was a way the article was a way to try to think through some of these things that we've been doing, and so to kind of have a chance to sit down with Sian Nai's work and try to make sense of what she means by the boring or the merely interesting, how that for me was really resonating and really helped to kind of free up some ways to think about it. So this is not really an answer. Except it's just to kind of think through it. And I remember seeing a talk from Lala Khalili about her work on shipping, and it was amazing for many reasons, but one of them was she kind of admitted just like loving cranes, and thought they were like really interesting to look at and think about. But then also, obviously, her work is totally much more complex than that. But somehow to be able to kind of exist in that space for me was sort of like, it was meaningful to have permission in a way to like admit that.
Maybe I'll jump in because I was named as a resident anthropologist. And because Jesse, you raised the question of loving the images or, the visual side of things. I could easily spend lots of time looking at Airbnb listings to relax, and I think that it's partly the aesthetics of Airbnbs and the work that goes into making those aesthetics by hosts that interested me initially in this project in Airbnb. And this particular essay was kind of a different exercise for me because it had nothing to do with what was inside the homes. That there were these other also kind of aesthetically vibrant spaces, AirDNA being one site that were doing a lot of work on what Airbnb could make possible in the world of Greece. So it's not exactly an answer except to say that to me it's interesting to consider what different registers of aesthetics one can consider. So it's like AirDNA is a certain kind of site that also speaks to investors because of the way it looks, presumably, and the way that it can visualize the data that can't be seen by someone who just hangs out on Airbnb and enjoys. So I think, I'm excited, really. I can't tell you how excited I am to be among visual and aesthetics and architectural people because it encourages me to think in this direction.
Well, what we, clearly discovered, even though it was sort of obvious, in a way, but we had to sort of prove it to ourselves with this building was, that, this modern building, which is a very lovely building, and the clients love it, and the architect love it, and people who live in it love it, and, it's, the modern house, and, we were thinking in terms of architecture school, this is a great example of it's a house that is sustainable. It looks good. It's nice, it's contextual, it's within the, it's done all the things that we teach, and yet, and so in other words, the aesthetic package is, from a pedagogical point of view, gets A+ on all registers. And yet when you begin to look at it, it's getting failing grades everywhere. And it's not the fault of the architect necessarily, right? Should the architect know all of this stuff or not? Maybe they should, And what, when we then went to the architect and said, did you ask where the sand came from, right? Why should I ask? All I need to do is press the button and the concrete guy shows up. So we've made it so easy. This aesthetics is not really anymore like 19th century, we have to do beauty. We have to, aesthetics is embedded, so to speak, in how we teach and operate. And it's sort of delaminates the question from how do we interrogate that? And as an architect myself, I'm torn. I'm not going to say that architecture is bad or evil, or I'm not quite there yet. Some people would say no, to go off to Missoula and build a cabin in the woods by yourself, and that's the only answer.
I think that's a great transition to an audience question that I think will maybe round out our time together. But thinking about who the architect is, a kind of figure who's asking for materials. Caroline Jones is asking to flip things and think about demand. What kinds of agents are asking for things? What kinds of things are possible to conceive within the frame of demand? And can we open that to new forms, new shapes for these relationships and these dynamics?
It's a really interesting question. Somebody who I was talking to about the project that's in the issue compared it to like the fishing labels on cans of tuna, where it's not so much that you can expressly quantify down to like the level of a fish or maybe even a trawler, but you know certain things about the fishing industry, and you can sort of, you know, have some kind of informed discussion with a person about maybe some pros and cons. And so I guess it's sort of, yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't know that it's ever going to be the architect's job to sort of follow every trail, you know, to infinity about every material in a project. But I think there's definitely a sort of growing understanding maybe of, shall we say, like embodied costs of things. I think right now everybody understands embodied carbon as this kind of thing that's been elevated in architectural production, but I think there's also many other embodied things that are part of the materials. So, you know, for instance, you know, Jesse was talking about, right? Like, I mean, the supply chain is like this very analog set of processes, right? And so I think there are certain generalizations that, let's say, a practicing architect might be able to impart to a client. You know, like there was just a story about the Corian, or actually I shouldn't say Corian specifically because I don't know, but one of these engineered countertops actually got into a lot of trouble because the cutting process was releasing dust, which was making people sick. So I think that's certainly a thing that you could communicate to a client and say, you know, yes, this is maybe a cheaper option, or maybe it comes in more colors, but you should consider, or at least be aware of, the fact that there's this harmful downside. I mean, it's you know, there's got to be some way for architects to communicate, you know, severity of impact, not just within the industry. I mean, that I think is actually kind of easier if we sort of all speak the same language, but you know, to a client, somebody who asks you for something, I think it should be totally reasonable to say, like, well, we can do this if you want to, but you should know before you proceed that this is, you know, there's pros and cons to everything.
If I can just say, oh, go ahead.
Please.
Just, I got excited thinking about what you just said, Galen. Imagining what it would be like if Airbnb listings had next, you know, a little, you know, icon that said like, this many people won't be able to get reasonable rent for, you know, because this Airbnb listing exists this way. You know, I just think it's a really powerful image to bring in demand into sort of an embodied practice. You don't even have to be an architect. You could just be a major platform like Airbnb.
I like the question because it makes me think about how we might think of demand as a collective thing and not a consumer thing. You know, that like often in the supply demand cycle we think about the consumer as the endpoint, but how do we think about it as a collective demand that might not be, you know, the product of individual agency, but something that is sort of generated? And I think about like on a read a typical urban design competition, there's an assumption that growth happens through private development and the enabling of that. And so how do we change the demand for something like that, where the expectation is that first the expectation might not be growth, the expectation might be health, and then the expectation might not be that it's through private enterprise, but through another format, another set of structures. And so I think that I don't think, I mean, for me, it's not like it's mutually exclusive, but I think that there's, to my mind, a kind of limit to what we can expect all of us to do around changing our demand habits. But then there's another place another level that can come in to think about how we might start to generate alternative ideas of what we should be asking for.
Sounds great. Let's do it.
But that's where the studio is so interesting, I think, because that's where you can test out these scenarios, and that's why I love the space of the studio, because it allows you to be uncomfortable, even if at the end you conclude that you were wrong completely. There's a space to really like invest in that simulation that's really powerful.
I mean, another boogaboo is that the classic separation between local and global is just really unusable in these situations, because the global is the new local in the building industries. I mean, that's what Home Depot, you know, has mastered. You know, so even if you find local wood sources, you may not want to use local wood sources because then you're chopping down your own trees, right? So the whole point about sourcing wood from Germany is let them do it. So, that's really where it's a really sort of no models and that sort of standard attempt to critique global through the local in the building industries supply chain. One has to come up with these other models, and maybe Jesse's point is, in other words, we need something past the consumer, right? Something, sustainability was like that, right? It tried to sort of come up with a category that was in some sense a meta category, but it quickly became a fraudulent system, just another way to sort of cheat the game, or rather game the system.
Well, I think we are a few minutes over time, and I hate to end on a downtrodden note, but I have greatly enjoyed your all of your contributions, and I really enjoyed this conversation, and I know Nina did as well. So thank you all, and thanks for everyone for coming to this evening. We hope you will join us next Thursday, April 8th at 6 p.m. for an evening with Mariam Kamara. See the full list of upcoming events at architecture.mit.edu. We hope to see you with us again.